I think the reality is that debt to GDP will continue to increase. So as a practical matter, this thing will go up, and I don't think the economy will stop. I think that economics are a relative problem where you have to weigh countries against each other.
In his most recent podcast, Chamath Palihapitiya shares his opinion regarding high inflation rates, the stock market, the crypto market, and the Fed.
When these big companies just get their act together, it's very hard to discern whether something is 80% as good or 120% better. There's this fuzzy gray area where a lot of people can find utility in a lot of different products, and then the one with the better distribution wins. And so if they take BART and they have the confidence now to just integrate it into Gmail or integrate it into these other points where they already have hundreds of millions of users, that's like a really tough distribution barrier to overcome. That's the next step that I think if Google really wants to win here, they have to force distribution of these tools in line to where people are. And if they do that, you're not going to know the difference between 80 and 100%. Someone as sophisticated as Sachs may be able to.
Is there any way out of this? We had a Trump town hall. I hate to bring it up and go back into, the sort of Trump commentary on all this, but he's the lead candidate, Sachs. And he said he thinks we can get out of debt. We just got to drill a bunch of oil, drill, baby, drill, and we'll get out of this problem. We'll be able to rebalance the budget. So Chamath and then Sachs.
I want to be clear. I don't think it's great that we have these enormous debts and entitlement obligations. But I also don't think that there's some magical number where the economy breaks. And the reason is because we're central to not just our economy, but everybody else's economy. We are the reserve currency of the world. It's not changing anytime soon. It's not even close. And we are, for better or worse, and I think Sachs and I don't like it, but we are the world's policeman. We are a bunch of things. We are the world's center of innovation. We are the world's center of these great leaps forward in humanity. When we talk about all of these different things, these aren't coming from random countries. They're coming from the United States. We can debate which company, but we're never debating the country. So I think that there's a legacy of value creation and innovation that we've always been at the forefront of, at least since America was founded, so 1776 to now. I think the reality is that debt to GDP will continue to increase. I don't think a single politician can practically get elected by offering to cut entitlement spending to people that have spent their entire lives paying into a system. So as a practical matter, this thing will go up, and I don't think the economy will stop. I think that economics are a relative problem where you have to weigh countries against each other. And what that means is the economic vibrancy, the productivity, the intellect, all of those things where we have to compete with El Salvador, we have to compete with Nigeria, we have to compete with India, we have to compete with Australia. And in that context, there is very little historical artifact that says that there's a breaking point. So I just think that if you observe the moment, it's not that what Friedberg is saying is bad. I'm not exactly sure that it's particularly actionable. And I think the disproportionate amount of action is actually the opposite, which is to reinflate the money supply, to reinflate assets, to create artificial prosperity and smear it to many, many, many people. And I think that you have to think about how do you want to activate your view? I can believe whatever I want, but at the end of the day, I don't want to act in a way that's against my economic best interest, quite honestly. So I believe that winning is measured in dollars and cents on these things. And from that perspective, I don't particularly like it. I think I'm emotionally more aligned to Friedberg, but the practical reality is I'm on the opposite side, which says the governments will keep spending, inflation will be here, assets will keep inflating, the M2 money supply will keep going up, and on general, I'm long the United States and short every other country.
Chamath, doesn't that ultimately lead to just inflation? It initially starts with the inflation of assets and asset prices, but it ultimately leads to the inflation of goods and services, which can cripple the economy because then, the middle class can't afford things and you have economic slowdown. I mean, that's the historical record of having these kind of inflationary moments.
Yeah, I mean, inflation comes and goes, but the position of the American US dollar hasn't changed. Again, you have to remember, like, a lot of these foreign governments, 187 or whatever the number is, countries outside the United States, rely on the US dollar. They don't want to own their own currency, right? And so, yeah, you're right. Dollars do get inflated, but that increased purchasing power also actually drives the balance of power back to the United States, because all of these other folks all of a sudden find the ability to import a little bit cheaper. Their economies get slightly better, but the US dollar actually still does well. So there's a complex set of interactions that are all relative. So I think it's very hard to point to the US middle class and say, oh, this is why the US breaks. I just don't see very many good examples in a modern globalist era. And there are examples, and I think Ray Dalio has pointed these out, when you look all the way in the back. But to use the UK, right, in the 15 and 1600s of the East India Trading Company, when we did not have a global economy or a global reserve currency, I don't think it's very useful. There's things you can learn, taxation. I think we can learn about why taxation does kill innovation. You said that before. I agree with that. But I don't think there's much value in saying, because it happened in these moments, it's going to happen exactly the same way here. And I think what people don't understand is we are in a unitary, singular, mono economy that is anchored by the US dollar. I think the thing you guys have to be open to is the fact that we've never really tested the ability for the US to borrow durationally beyond 30 years. And again, we talked about what an error it was in judgment for the Treasury not to issue 100-year bonds. But I think if there's any country in the world that can issue 100-year bonds, it's the United States of America. And I do think that they'll be able to get durational assets that are that far out on the yield curve. So I, again, am less concerned about the debt wall here, because I think you'll be able to push maturities out. You'll be able to refi a bunch of short-term obligations into the future. And if you look at where the yield curve is, 10 years at 3.5, 340 something. So the thought is that inflation goes down. If you put it out to 100 years, I would be very surprised if 100-year rates, if they priced a bond, weren't somewhere sub 1%. So I do think it becomes effectively free money for the United States. And I think it's just a practical thing they need to explore. By the way, corporates have explored these 50-year bonds and greater. So I think it's just like, it's a matter of mathematics, as you guys have just illustrated here, that the US has to push out past 30 years. So we'll have 50-year US bonds. We'll have 100-year US bonds. Again, I'm not here to claim whether it's right or wrong, but I think the simple way to acknowledge that is just that we are going to reinflate the money supply over the long term, because it's the only sustainable way that politicians can get elected and reelected. And I think the best thing to do there is to own risk assets.